Railway Conversations with Doc Frank.
Authentic discussions with interesting people about railway subjects that matter.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Railway Conversations with Doc Frank. I'm your host of this podcast, Doc Frank, and my guest today is Roy Unny from Melbourne in Australia. It's the second time that Roy is on the show. I did an episode with him, number 22, in early June, when we were talking about the upcoming core conference in Melbourne. Now, at that conference, Roy presented something about the topic I knew very little about, I must admit, which is reference class forecasting. And I listened to this presentation and found it so intriguing that I thought I'm doing an episode on that together with Roy, who is a certified practitioner of this discipline. And for those of you who don't exactly know what it is, I think you will enjoy this episode a lot and learn something from it as well. The idea is to improve the estimating process for project costs and project durations. Also for project benefits, which is a bit more difficult, but Roy will explain all this. And as usual, if you like this episode, then please check out the other ones, including, of course, the first one with Roy again, which was number 22. Please enjoy. Hi, it's Doc Frank again, real quick before you head off. If you are a fan of communications-based train control or short CBTC, there's an event coming up in September that you absolutely don't want to miss. It's the first virtual global CBTC conference. It's called CBTC World Summit 2023, and it's happening on the 20th and the 21st of September. There will be 3 sessions of about 6 hours duration each for 3 different global regions, one for Asia Pacific, one's for North and South America, and one's for Europe and the Middle East. So wherever you are in the world, one of those sessions will be during the daytime in your time zone, and you can watch it live for the full 6 hours with 6 presentations. The kicker about this is that all other presentations, including the ones from your own session, will be available for replay via recordings. So that means that if the other session should be in the middle of your night, you can still watch it on demand at a time that's more convenient for you and doesn't interfere with your good night's sleep. The conference is available for registration right now at my training portal under docfranktraining.podia.com/summit23. I repeat that, docfranktraining.podia.com/summit23. I'm putting a lot of effort into this conference. It will be an absolute blockbuster event, and I very much hope to see you there. Until then, keep it simple and bye for now. Roy, welcome back to the show.
It feels like just yesterday I was doing a podcast with you, so thank you for the invite.
Yeah, that's true. It was in fact quite recently. So for the listeners out there, I did an interview with Roy, I think in early June. It was just before the core conference in Melbourne. That was one of your major undertakings to organize this or co-organize this as the chair of the RTSA. During core, you gave a presentation on a topic that I must admit I've never heard before, and shame on me for not knowing about this, but it was about a topic called reference class forecasting. And I thought, well, what is this? And then I thought, okay, if Roy presents about it, it's probably interesting. So I listened up, and I was sitting in that session anyway because I was presenting right after you. And I found it extremely interesting because what it does is creating a reference class of many comparable projects, and based on that, on those references, estimate the cost of a project and the schedule, the duration of a project. And I think it can also be applied to the benefits, if I read your paper correctly.
Correct. So in fact, I probably chose the most boring title for my paper. application of reference class forecasting to the Australia passenger rail market. What I should have called it is optimism and why our rail projects are billions of dollars in cost overruns, according to newspapers. And that probably would have excited things a little bit more, but that's okay. This is now my chance to recover from that title.
Yeah, yeah. I wasn't expecting that you would replace a very long title with a yet longer title. So I thought you come up with something short and catchy. Well, we will work on that, but not necessarily today. The topic was still very, very interesting. And one thing that intrigued me, there were a number of things that intrigued me. One thing that intrigued me was that you said you are a certified practitioner on that topic of reference class forecasting. And that made it even more embarrassing for me that I never heard about it. So if that's a real education behind it and the certification process, well, tell me more about this. How did this come about? How did you get to the idea to do this in the first place? And where did you go to get your education and your subsequent certificate?
So it actually started in 2021 when I was working for Infrastructure Australia in managing the National Study of Infrastructure Risk. And through that work, we engaged Oxford Global Projects, who are a world-renowned consultancy founded about how to deliver mega projects without tears, as their slogan is. And Oxford Global Projects is one of the major items they deal with is reference class forecasting. And through that work with Infrastructure Australia, we engaged them, and they did some initial reference classes, which I'll talk about shortly, for the Australian market. But it was based on international data. And coming out of that, I said, no, there's got to be enough data in Australia. And about a year later, I determined that there's something here, but in order to do it, I needed to take the action. So they offered a certified RCF practitioner course, and my employer was Mont McDonald, was able to fund it. And so I was able to take the course. Now, you're all about online training courses. So in this case, during COVID, they converted all their training to be online. And it takes a bit of effort. So you're talking 3 to 4 months, weekend work, evening work. There's a lot of reading you need to do, but it's mixed media training. So there's YouTube videos, there's reading material, there's several assignments and quizzes. But to become a certified practitioner, you actually have to do an assignment and actually practice the art. And once you do that and it's reviewed by one of their experts, you basically can become a certified practitioner and apply it. So the assignment I chose was actually looking at the Australian passenger rail market. And I then extended that 6 months later and actually wrote a paper on my own, which was basically taking the assignment and converting it into a paper, which I presented at the Conference of Railway Excellence last month. So what is, so I might as well talk about what is reference class forecasting. It is about the future, but it's also looking at what have we done in the past and actually removing, and you have to step back and look at human psychology here. You have to remove optimism bias. And we as humans are overly optimistic. It is a proven trait that we have. And you're in the signaling business, and how many times have suppliers or industry experts come to you and said, this time we're going to do the signaling project right. It's going to be on time. It's going to be on budget. I assume many times. And so the reality is, how do you remove that? So as engineers, when we design a bridge or when we design a signaling system, we're trained to not look at optimism bias. We're trained to go based on previous experience, rules that you follow, safety factors that you use. So we're trained as engineers to do that. But when it comes to doing it at the project level, looking at costs, looking at schedules, we throw that all away and basically say, oh, we'll do a bottom-up estimate. The politicians have said it's going to be X billion. Yeah, we can do it for that. So there's a discrepancy there. So reference class forecasting is almost an engineering approach that you take.
Yes, I had examples in the past which I referred to in my training courses where, for example, London Underground, the first two CBTC projects that they did there, the first one was on the Jubilee line, the second one was on the Northern line. And I was at a conference in London to hear them present on the second project on the Northern line. And it was celebrated as a big success that the Northern line was implemented on schedule, while the first project, the Jubilee line, was way delayed. And the reason for that I found very interesting was that for the Northern line, for the second project, they actually scheduled buffers into the project timetable, into the project schedule. And you look at this with some project management experience and you said, well, isn't that the normal thing to do? So not so much, oh, congratulations that you've done it in the second project, but more like, why didn't you do this in the first project? Why did you allow the first project to run late? Because you didn't think of any buffers. I'm not sure whether that fits into that optimism bias category, but
it is very much related to that. And not all projects are have cost overruns. As my study looked at cost, and you have to basically have a statistically valid data set. Now, once you get to about 15 or 20 projects, just rules of statistics for anyone that's taken statistics, it starts to become valid. And so what you have to find is the appropriate class of reference projects for you to look at and compare your project to. So in my case, what I did is I came up with 33 projects, rail projects for passenger rail in Australia. In total, they represented $60 billion and 600 track kilometers worth of work. I made sure it was representative of the entire country, a little bit of brownfield, greenfield, some electrified, some not electrified, but really focused on the passenger rail market. But I did exclude signaling projects, pure signaling projects, or pure rolling stock projects. And through that study, you basically have to develop your cumulative probability distribution curves, et cetera. But the conclusion effectively is from what you initially said your project was going to be. If you want, and it's all about levels of confidence. If you want an 80% level of confidence that what you're saying at the beginning is what the actual cost will be, you need to put in an uplift of 40%. So if it's $1 billion rail project, statistically, it's been proven that in Australia right now, for an 80% level of confidence, you'd have to basically say, I need 1.4 billion. Now, that's not to say that extra 400 million is risk amount, but you have to be able to understand and plan for what if that happens. So either you can do more studies at the front end, you can look at the project again, de-risk it. And there's various methods that you can do, but it's really just stepping back and saying, all right, you're prepared to do this project as a state or as an entity. Are you prepared to also take into account the potential for this type of a project in this reference class to be at the higher end? And that's something, we have to accept as engineers, but as politicians. So it bothers me when I see the news releases about, this project was $2 billion overrun, or Inland Rail, $15 billion overrun. Well, hold on. What was our original baseline? And did we do a reference class at the same point? So I didn't look at Inland Rail as an example, but there are global projects of similar scope and scale that really should have been looked at. Or conversely, I didn't look at pure signaling projects, but there would be a reference class of signaling projects around the world to look at.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I actually had when you were just talking about this example of a $1 billion project that should have been 1.4 for a P80 probability, which means in 80% of the cases you will stay within the budget.
Right.
But
or conversely, one interruption. Yeah. Conversely, 20% of the projects come in or under what you originally said it was going to be. So as engineers, and let's say majority of the people listening to this podcast are engineers, we would never do a design project based on only a 1 in 5% chance it's going to work. So why do we do that on schedule and projects?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's probably, how can you be certain on an estimate? Yeah. And if you just inflate the numbers just to make certain that you don't overrun at the end, then
so this is a way of this is a way of not inflating the numbers, but of saying, hold on, based on that reference class, this is an appropriate number to be using. Now, again, it's not a number that you hold as your contingency and risk. It's a probability, and you have to sit there and say, am I prepared for that outcome, or am I going to take certain actions that reduce the likelihood of that outcome? So it's a change in thought process. Just like, for example, when a new major metro project is announced and somebody says it's, let's say a politician, it's going to be $10 billion. Perhaps those announcements should be made, and it's one of my recommendations, along with a level of certainty. At least there's more transparency in the process here, because what happens then, and we're seeing it right now with Sydney Metro and the new government coming in, it's going to be 25 billion. We have to do a major cost review. And as I reviewed in my report, hold on, if you had actually done a reference class for it, you're probably fit within the level of probabilities of that of a metro project of that size could actually end up being at the price that it's turning out to be. Now, what I'm not doing is telling you how to deliver the project more cost efficiently, et cetera. That's a separate matter that's dealt with by the engineers and the project managers. This is really about, at the front end, giving context to what we're doing here and what we're delivering.
But back to my question about what's the baseline of your estimate. So I'll give you an example. When I worked on the business case for high capacity signaling in Perth, which is a signaling project that was excluded from your study, but nonetheless, we did a quantitative risk analysis, which is what you mentioned in your paper as well. And we needed to calculate two estimates, one which was called P50 and one which was called P90. So, and according to what you just said, that's a 50% probability that you hit your budget, or a 90% probability, so more likely that you hit your budget. So my question would be, which of those is actually the benchmark that you say it's $1 billion project?
So we in Australia don't properly follow some of the business case methodologies that are out there. So what I generally use as the base case is for lack of a better word, the budgeted number that shows up in the budgets for the project. Now, whether that's a P80 or a P50, I don't know, but I go based as that's my original baseline in whatever year the project was announced, and we see it. And, I have to, part of reference class forecasting is this auditing process, going back and saying, what was it? So I don't have access to the business cases. I'm not an auditor by trade. So whatever the original announced figure for the project is the base case. But again, in the process of developing those P50s and P80s, that's where the optimism bias comes through. Intentionally or not intentionally, that comes through. And despite you doing the P80, I'm kind of taking a holistic view, a macro view, and saying, okay, that's great that you've done it. If this is your baseline, but go look at similar projects and what they've actually delivered over the last, whatever reference class you use, let's say use the last 10 years or 15 years, and you find similar projects, and you'll find your own reference class curve for that. And you actually have to marry the two. So it's not about it's one approach or another. You actually use both together. And over time, as the project gets delivered, the QRA process becomes more important. And the reference class is really about, that was the front end work. And there's a feedback going back. So to me, it's really about, it doesn't matter whether it's a P50 or the P80. It's the one that was announced at the start of the project.
Do you see this method as a real help for projects to plan more realistically? Because what I thought I heard earlier you saying was it would have explained a cost overrun. But I mean, that doesn't make it any better. The problem is already there, that somebody budgeted and put funding up for a certain amount of money, say for 100%, and then the project suddenly ends up being at 200%, which means you need to find twice the money that nobody had anticipated and that nobody had in any risk contingency, because whatever contingency you've got, it's never 100%, right?
So a reference class curve is not static. Anytime a new project is completed for your reference class, you want to bring it back and update your reference class curve. So if we start delivering projects, not better, but if we start being more realistic in what the actual cost was and delivering it within that, then over time, our reference class will be driven down. And in parallel with that, obviously, we want to deliver projects more efficiently. So that's the mentality of looking at it. So don't view it as a cost overrun. It's about, are we being realistic at the front end about how this project is going to be delivered? Now, I only looked at costs, but schedule is just as an important one. And as a future study, I'll probably look at schedule. So in a passenger rail market, for example, it would be when was the first date of passenger rail service? And generally a fairly straightforward one to come up with. But then how do you go back in history and say, what did we originally say was going to be the start date? And that's where some of the detective work will be required. But that's just as important, because then it feeds into this behavior of, oh, all the passenger rail projects are, going to take X longer years than what we said we were going to be. And so that feeds into this almost a negative view of the way projects are delivered. So it's kind of the opposite of the optimism bias. There's this mentality that, we can't deliver projects properly. But I'm sitting here going, hold on, maybe that optimism bias was there at the beginning and we weren't realistic about it.
Yeah, I think, I think something needs to be done, because the way that the big mega projects develop at the moment here in Australia is, I would say, frightening. Yeah, because what happens if projects like Inland Rail and the big Sydney Metro project like Metro West or so, if they balloon out cost-wise and also time-wise, what this does is undermining the trust of the project sponsors, like the politicians who paid for the projects. And then in the future, well, one, you have to find the additional money, which means that you can't fund other projects that would have gotten that additional money otherwise. And secondly, they may become hesitant to go forward with those mega projects in the first place. And it's not
Correct.
just in Australia. If I look what's happening in the UK, for example, with Crossrail, what's now called the Elizabeth Line, High Speed 2 is probably another example. Before that, there was an issue with the Subsurface Lines project, which is a signaling project, so that was of big interest for me. So it seems that it's almost like an epidemic of projects running over big time.
But I tie it back to the psychology of this, which is the optimism bias of when we announce the project. What psychologically has happened between the politicians and the engineers and the project managers? There is this optimism there, and there's nothing wrong with optimism. I'm just trying to bring some methodology here that says, okay, it's great that you've got that, but here's a reality of what could happen, and are you prepared for that outcome? I don't like it when I see the news reports that are out there about, project overrun of $2 billion. Well, hold on. Was it a real project overrun, or was the original estimate behind the project or the original basis, were we a little bit too optimistic? So it is a bit of a mental shift, and it doesn't take away from the QRA processes, et cetera, but it's basically saying, hey, this is what historically has happened. And we can't ignore that. And that's why I use my analogy of the engineers. We would never, as engineers, use optimism bias when we do our designs. So somehow we allow that to permeate through cost estimates or scheduling.
Yeah. I mean, optimism bias is probably one thing, but sometimes I could also mention that it's something like a target cost or a target time frame that's given externally. I mean, the extreme case is if you've got events like Olympic Games or a soccer World Cup or something like this, where if I look back at last year in Qatar, Doha was building a metro system which was due to be completed ahead of the soccer World Cup. So you can't really say, "Oh, sorry, I'm behind with my metro project. Let's just postpone the soccer World Cup by 6 months or so."
If you look up Oxford Global Projects and Olympics are in a special class of projects that are always been proven to be suffer from cost overruns. That in particular is a very interesting subset of the global list of projects that are delivered. So it was one of the things I read during my certification course, and yeah, it's definitely a world in its own when you're dealing with World Cup or Olympics. But a reference class doesn't have to be multi-billion-dollar projects. You can apply it to even small consulting assignments. You can apply it to small signaling upgrade projects. You just have to have an appropriate reference class to compare it to. And it's almost, you can sometimes just use it as a cross-check. How many times have we done small consulting assignments as consultants and said, oh, I can do that for 80 hours. And then you find out that you've actually spent 160. Now, why did you say 80 hours or something? Because again, that optimism bias is coming through. And this is a way of actually saying, hold on, I always said it was going to be this. This is what the reality is happening. But then you're more transparent even to yourself to say, I'm prepared to do it for that lower amount, but knowing that it might actually take this much. So you can apply it not just to the multi-billion-dollar rail projects. You can apply it to any reference class, really.
Yeah. So with regards to the study that you've done, where you created apparently for the first time ever a reference class for passenger rail projects in Australia, where do you see the value of this going forward? Do you think it was just an academic exercise which ended up in you getting this certificate, and or do you see
definitely not. So
including potentially consultancy work, which is quite specialized in that area and relatively rare, I believe.
So I did make a couple of recommendations. So one was Infrastructure Australia and their state-based I bodies who tend to review business cases put forward. They should do reference class forecasting as part of their project reviews. Now, whether that's consulting work on the side, and I give an example where a small 5-kilometer tram extension project in Edinburgh actually engaged a consultant to do an RCF study to say, have we appropriately mitigated the risk so that we'll be at the lower end of the reference curve? And actually the study demonstrated that they were probably going to be less risky. So increased their confidence that they wouldn't be at the higher end of the curve, but at the lower end of the curve. The second recommendation is really about just training professionals and project engineers on RCF, not that they have to do it, but to understand the basis behind it and understand how optimism bias can really affect your view of cost and schedule and project benefits. And it's really about just increasing transparency. Probably the most difficult one is, and this is difficult in the sense that I doubt it will actually happen, is project cost announcements should be provided with a level of certainty. To me, there's nothing wrong with a politician saying it'll be, let's say, a $10 billion project with an 80% certainty. To me, that's transparency. I know to other people they want exact figures, but to me, it does provide an understanding of the reality is it's not going to be that exact number.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, it's a question of transparency, because normally the budgets that are being announced are already based on a P50 or P90 estimate. So, but it's not being talked about. Yeah, everybody treats those numbers as if they were absolute, like P100 figures.
Correct. And I have no clue whether they're P80 or P90, but I just go based on what the figures were. And maybe people have been more optimistic and have gone with P50. But it certainly is a detective exercise to go through the last 15 years of projects and find out what they originally said. And when I did my presentation, I gave an example where a project was on the first day of passenger service. It was announced that it came in $300 million under budget. But actually, if you go back and look at what the original announcement was, it was 600 million. It was expected to be 600 million lower than it actually was. So it never came in under what the cost was. So you really have to be careful about how what your data is that you rely on. And that's probably the most difficult part of this, is finding the data. The good news is in Australia, we're transparent with audit bodies. And so in many cases, I was able to find audit reports and you use those audit reports as a source of truth.
Yeah. I was wondering, I mean, we coming back to those estimates that I was involved in, we really tried to minimize the inside knowledge of people being too close to the job. So we were getting external cost estimators in that applied benchmarks from comparable exercises for certain activities to basically verify whether the estimates seemed realistic or whether they seemed underestimated, in which case they were adjusted upwards. So all of those things were done, and I'm not really sure, because I simply don't have the visibility. I'm not really sure whether the same amount of rigor is being applied everywhere. Yeah, and I have the sneaky suspicion that sometimes it's not. Yeah, so if I don't know, if a cost estimate blows up by 100%. I mean, this is even way above anything that you just mentioned coming out of this reference class forecasting. And if this happens in a couple of years and the previous benchmark was already done during COVID, so you can't really say, okay, well, we didn't know about COVID. Now COVID came and now everything is I don't know, doubled up or so.
Understood.
So this is not the case, because the last correction of the estimate, which was already way higher than the original one, I think by 60%. So there was an original estimate. I'm thinking inland rail now. There was an original estimate which the politicians ran around with of $10 billion. And then a couple of years ago, it was 16 billion, which is already a 60% upraise.
Yeah.
And now this 160% has doubled. So we are now basically at more than 3 times the original estimate.
Sure. Did it suffer from optimism bias? Of course it did. So I would look at a reference class of similar length freight railway projects being delivered globally, because there's very few in Australia that would be of that length. And I'm sure you could find 15 or so projects and apply the same reference class forecasting to it. And without doing it, my gut feeling says that the 10 billion would have been easily demonstrated to be suffering from an optimism bias. Now, some people will say, yes, but because of the 10 billion, the project was approved. That's a separate discussion that, as politicians and us as who elect the politicians, we have to decide whether we accept that. But the data definitely would have said it was not a $10 billion project. I can 100% kind of guarantee you that.
Yeah, but normally, what I'm wondering, normally the more you get into the project. So if at the outset there may be optimism bias, I agree with that. But once you are 4 years in the project and you have seen something like COVID coming up, and COVID was at the time, I think, 12, 18 months in, so you could already see the amount of havoc this was causing to supply chains and construction costs and what have you. And so you have a shot to basically adjust your estimate. Do you still think that at this point in time there is still an optimism bias which is so so strong and so dominant that only 2 years later you suddenly have twice the cost. I really struggle to.
You may struggle with that,
this.
but based on the training that I did and all the reports and papers that I reviewed, I am of the view that yes, that is an inherent human trait, and we exhibit that as engineers. Though, and I keep bringing it down to engineers, we've been trained to ignore that, and I'm not sure how that's worked with engineering through the training process, but we seem to be able to turn that switch off when it comes to the designs that we do. But when it comes to forecasting how we're going to deliver a project, we seem to be able to turn that switch off and say, no, this is what it's going to be. Now, there is a constant feedback loop that you have to give. And a reference class is always based on, way at the beginning of the project. In your case, what you're saying is, well, this is my updated estimate. Is that my new baseline? So, of course, we could do a reference forecast based on what it was halfway through the project and what we think it'll cost to deliver. But that's really not what the basis of it is. You're really going back to the beginning to help frame how you make your decisions.
Yeah.
And we're talking today about rail, but actually when you go into the theories and really understand it, the applicability to major hydro projects, major nuclear projects, if we really want to talk about the mega projects that are out there, is 100% proven in there. And, just recently, Snowy Hydro is in the news about major multi-billion-dollar cost overruns. If you probably went and looked at reference class forecasts for major hydro projects, you would definitely see that this definitely would have happened. So somehow we got caught up in there again with the optimism bias that, well, we delivered Snowy Hydro successfully in the 50s. This time we're going to do it much more efficiently than we ever did. So at a macro level, from my point of view, we're seeing that optimism bias continue to come through. Now, the good news is in my reference cost forecast for the rail projects, we weren't really seeing an exponential curve at the end, which says to me that was a good news. We weren't seeing 200-300% cost overruns on these set of passenger rail projects. And so to me, that was a positive takeaway. In the international data set of rail projects, you'll see that. Now, inland rail may be one of those, but you'd have to do a reference class forecast for that, or any new major signaling only project in this country. I think definitely signaling projects need a global reference class to look at, and that would be one recommendation for us perhaps jointly to look at. The hard part, of course, with signaling projects is what is the length of contract. Sometimes it's a limited supplier marketplace, so there's different things at play there. What are you have to make sure you're comparing sometimes apples to apples. So do you include maintenance in it, et cetera? But those are things that we could probably do.
I would love to end this conversation on a high note, but to be honest, I'm struggling with this right now. Maybe you've got an idea, something that gives more hope for the future, because the way that the industry stands at the moment doesn't look extremely promising and extremely, I would always say, extremely trustworthy. Because, well, if the cost estimates and the time estimates are repeatedly undershot by substantial margins, then, as I said, this undermines the trust of the project sponsors, the people funding the projects, the public, and the industry as well.
Yes.
So where's the silver lining here?
The fact that there's a 20% probability that your project will come in under what you said it was. So what we need to do is actually understand what makes those projects. And it's not 20% of the projects, it's a 20% probability. But through my data set, we could actually find the projects and understand what resulted in the ones to be at the lower end of the curve and actually bring those attributes forward. In some cases, yes, it may have been they had a significant contingency, but I suspect not in all cases. And there's methodologies that you can apply. So the learning is You can divide projects into modular. That's a very proven approach, and it's something that maybe we should be looking at. Modularity tends to eliminate a lot of that. So there's lessons learned that will improve the ability to deliver projects. And I think we're still at the stage with the massive growth we've had over the last 10 years that we now need to switch to taking those learnings to deliver it better going forward. And we've had to relearn effectively how to rebuild tunnels in CBD environments. For rail, that's something that we weren't doing for a long time. And now in the last 10 years, Perth, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane are all delivering brand new underground metro tunnels. That's something we had to learn. But definitely we take those learnings and we're going to be much better at it in the future and be more realistic in terms of what the cost and timeframes are going to be. So to me, that's a positive.
Okay. Well, one takeaway I would see here is that at least people should try very hard to do everything in their might to reduce the risk of blowouts, the risk of cost increases. I'm thinking of scope creep, for example, to really have a very open eye on these things and try to avoid this as much as possible, and then also doing proper risk management. So the way that I learned it was that you start up with a project, you've got a risk base or contingency base that's at maximum level, and then as you progress and get more certainty of the outcome, the contingency and the risk allocation should come down until the end of the project, where you know precisely where you're landing, and then you don't need any additional risk or any contingency because it has become reality.
Just a nuance in the point there. Some of the reasons why these projects are coming in much higher is due to scope creep. But as I pointed out in my paper, scope creep isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's just you didn't forecast at the beginning. And this is where the whole reference class forecasting comes in. You were optimistic at the beginning that there wasn't going to be scope creep, but the reality is there has been scope creep. And this is again about being transparent and saying, look, the project is 80% certainty, but perhaps we are going to have scope creep. There's the famous Donald Rumsfeld quote of the known unknowns. We know we're going to have unknowns when we deliver these projects. We're in brownfield passenger rail environments for the most time. And we know these things are going to happen despite our best efforts. So to me, it's really about understanding and capturing that and at least being prepared to deal with it, as opposed to having major news items and news reports that come out about major cost overruns, and it feeds into this behavior that we're doing things bad or wrong. It's about just changing the paradigm a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it probably also depends on what the reason for the scope creep is. I mean, if for instance you dig a metro tunnel and suddenly you find some archaeological treasures that you couldn't anticipate. Okay, well, fair enough. That you need to deal with that, and that was kind of unforeseen. Unless you're digging underneath Athens, in which case you might kind of expect something like this, or Rome or something like that. But there are other types of scope creep which I think should be avoidable, like additional functionality. Yeah, wouldn't it be nice if the system could this as well? Well, maybe it would be nice, but maybe I should have thought about this beforehand. And if I do it now in hindsight, then there will be those negative effects on project costs and project budget. And I think this would be, if anything, this would be a kind of optimism bias that should be fought quite radically. Like the optimism bias, I can dial up the functionality that I want, but everything else will remain constant. So there will be no cost overrun, no time overrun. Everything will be fine, even though I'm dialing up the functional scope of the project, which to me is complete delusion.
So where you're coming into is the area of project benefits, and how do you tangibly measure project benefits, and the what you think you're going to get versus what you actually get. And it works both ways. And in some cases, you will want actually more functionality as you go on. So it's probably the most difficult area of project benefits to bring into rail. What is a project benefit? And I haven't properly addressed that in my paper. I was really just focusing on costs, but it is an interesting area to explore. And a project benefit is functionality when it comes to signaling.
Yeah. Maybe that's the reason why your paper stayed at 10 pages and didn't go 250 or something like that.
Yes.
All right. Okay, let's wrap this up here. I didn't really expect that we come to a conclusion that makes significantly more hope for the future, but maybe there will be lessons learned from the recent events, and lessons learned that are not just written down on a piece of paper, but that are actually flowing into subsequent projects. And yes, and so that the industry as such comes back to a higher degree of reliability with their estimates, and according to that, a higher trustworthiness, because at the end of the
100%.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, this is what the whole thing is about. Yeah, so I like to take Sydney Metro. I used to like to take Sydney Metro as an example, where the first line Sydney Metro Northwest was being built. And all the promises were kept. So certain project stages were delivered on time or even slightly ahead of time. The project was delivered on budget, and the politicians at the time were so enthusiastic about this level of project success that they couldn't throw additional money fast enough at the whole Sydney Metro program. Mm-hmm. So additional lines were committed and put in the budget and everything. And I'm watching this with a lot of concern that now even in Sydney Metro, the budgets are end up higher than was initially estimated. So the initial trust seems to be fading away more and more, which is a big concern, I think. And this is something
that's at the program level, and I'd be interested to see how many similar cities around the world have similar type of multiple metro programs, and could you do a reference class at that really mega level? I don't have the answer there, but there probably is a number of other cities that are doing something similar. And you'd have to be very specific with your reference class. You wouldn't probably look at Asian countries. You'd probably be more focused on similar cities to Sydney. But maybe you would look at Asian countries. I don't know. The open discussion to decide.
Okay, well, in any case, thanks very much. I thought it was a very interesting discussion on a very interesting topic that I definitely know more about now than what I used to know about it before call, which was pretty much zero.
Thank you very much. And if any one of your listeners want a copy of my paper or presentation, just reach out to me or go and become a certified RCF practitioner.
Yes.
On your own.
The best thing to contact you is probably via LinkedIn, I guess.
LinkedIn would be the easiest, yes.
Yeah, all right. Okay, well, then again, thanks very much for your time, Roy. It was certainly good to have you on the podcast a second time with a slightly different topic. And you are actually the first guest that's coming up here for the second time.
Thank you for the honor, Doc Frank.
Yeah. If you write more interesting papers in the future, then who knows? Yeah.
I'll see what I can do.
All right, great. And to all the listeners, as usual, if you like that podcast, then also check out the other episodes. Predominantly, of course, the previous episode with Roy, which was very interesting as well. And subscribe, tell your friends about it, do all the good stuff. As usual, until next time, keep it simple and bye for now. Hi, this is Doc Frank from the studio. I want to inform you about my latest and greatest training development, and it is all about the mindset of a high-capacity railway organization. What I found in my experience of training and consulting is that often you have projects for new technology which seem to be perfectly planned, which are very well executed, and they still don't lead to the success that was expected. And very often the reason for that is mindset. key stakeholders that have what I call a legacy mindset, an outdated old ways of thinking where the new technology is treated in the same way as the old one, but it's just not suitable to get the most out of the new technology. What I'm offering in this training course, which is called High Capacity Railway Mindset, is that every month there's a new training module with 5 examples of an outdated legacy mindset, the suggestion of a new mindset more suitable for a high capacity railway, and how to get from the old to the new mindset. So those modules will be repeated every month for an entire year. So in total, we are talking about 60 different examples how to get from an old mindset to a more suitable new mindset. And the cost for this is only $10 per example. So this can be paid monthly, this can be paid for a year. And there is an early bird special where until the end of July, you're only paying for 10 months instead of 12. So you get 12, you only pay for 10. And then you have the usual service of an alumni community afterwards where you can ask ongoing questions for at least 12 months after the training. You find more information and you can sign up on my training portal, docfranktraining.podia.com/mindset. I hope I see you at this training. It's really leading edge stuff. Nobody else in the world is training on this. And if you really want to explore the ultimate frontier of success in technology projects, then this is the training you need to take. I hope I see you there. And now let's get back to the podcast. Hey, Doc Frank here, host of the Railway Conversations podcast. Thank you for listening.